Continuing education knows that at the end of the day, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we really listen to their needs, and we can offer them flexible options both within continuing education and across the campus.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
I am the Executive Director and Chief Curator for the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art here in Boulder, Colorado. For recording purposes, today's date is Tuesday, April 14th, 2026. The panel time is 9:30 a.m. And the panel title, so I hope you are all in the right room, it's From Earth to Expression, Using Nature as Material and Inspiration. And my background is in art and visual art, so the focus of the panel is going to be, I hope, or my questions are going to be kind of leading towards that conversation. Now, before we get started, I would like to read the University of Colorado's Boulder's Land Acknowledgement. The University of Colorado's Boulder, Colorado flagship university honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous people in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territorial and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous people, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous people and issues locally and globally. We'll do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting students' success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you once again. Welcome to the CWA conference and today's discussion. A little notes that I would like to also include. We ask that all of our attendees remain respectful throughout the discussion and refrain from interruptions. Signs, banners, noisemakers, and other audible disruptions are not permitted and will result in those responsible being asked to leave the room. Time will be allotted for questions from our in-person audience, and we will take your questions via handwritten note cards, and I think the producers are going to be passing cards and a pen, and if you have a question, please share them with them, and I will choose those questions. Please write legibly. And now I would like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and I remind our audience that full speakers' bios can be found online at the CWA website. So, welcome you all, and I will start with Nalini.
Okay. Thank you, David. As a scientist who basic research and output, and what I'm judged by scientific papers. They are probably the least aesthetic output of creative activities that you can imagine, but I have found compelling connections between science and arts. I study cloud forests in Costa Rica, one of the most vulnerable biomes on our planet, and have been witnessing with alarm the increasing impacts of human activities like deforestation, forest fragmentation, and climate change. And to address these challenges, I think scientists like me must go beyond their own science to raise awareness and support and participation from those outside of science. My first works in public engagement were traditional, giving talks at museums, writing articles for natural history museums, participating in natural history documentaries, but I soon saw that I was engaging people who were already attracted to and participating in ecology. I was really just preaching to the choir. And so I felt that I needed to broaden my reach, both to connect to new audiences, but also to gain different perspectives for myself. So I established, with the support of the National Geographic Society, a series of what I call canopy confluences. These are week-long forays into the forest and its canopy environment, to which I invited artists of all kinds: visual artists, sculptors, dancers, poets, creative writers, and rap singers. We taught each of them how to climb up into the canopy using my mountain climbing techniques, and they sat on treetop platforms for whole days at a time, experiencing life above the forest floor. And we asked them to express what they were seeing and what they were feeling with their own forms of expression. And in their presence, I began to see the forest differently. I started viewing light gradients from the canopy to the forest floor, not just with graphs of photon density, but through an artist's lens, that is, as shifting tones of green, of light and shadows, of texture and of emotion. And Bruce Chow, who is a sculptor, pointed out to me that when we nailed plant tags at 5-meter intervals from the top of the tree to the bottom, we changed the nature of the forest. And this is something like I had not been aware of before, but I saw that it was a metaphor of how activities of humans, including scientists, can unthinkingly, unwittingly affect our environment. Well, those artists carried their work into their own venues of art galleries, of poetry readings, of dance theaters, and of slam poetry contests, reaching audiences that were far beyond the conservation groups that I had been able to get. And one collaborator, a rap artist, made nature accessible and compelling for urban youth who might never otherwise encounter it. We also invited what I call tree novices, people who have never experienced trees, to get their perspectives on trees. And these included 2 Inuits from Nunavut in the north of Canada, where the tundra supports no trees at all. Well, after a week of climbing and living among trees, one of them, Brian, shared a painting he had made around the campfire the last evening we were there. The painting was a stack of stones in front of a tree. He explained that in his homeland, these stone cairns serve as guideposts. And then he said, this week I've seen that trees are your guideposts. You should care for them as we care for our cairns, because without them, you are lost. And for me, that was one of the most powerful conservation statements that I've ever heard, but coming from someone who had never encountered a tree before. Another Confluence participant, who's a modern dance choreographer named Jody Lomask, created a modern dance called Biome that was inspired by her participation in a tropical rainforest confluence. For her performances in San Francisco and Seattle, I started it off with a brief talk about rainforest ecology and conservation, and then her troupe performed the dance and gave life to those ideas through movement. And afterward, in the lobby, we offered the audience opportunities to participate in local conservation activities, and many of them signed up. And I saw that it was her creative expression that prompted these actions. These interactions also led, with artists, also led me to think about how I might become someone who could express herself through artistic creation. And so I have become a wood turner in the last few years, a maker of bowls. They're really clumsy and not very attractive, but they are bowls. And I have come to understand trees through a different medium, through the the smell of the wood and the feel of the grain. And so I've come to have sort of an intimacy with trees that I haven't before. But it has also led to actions of conservation. I've been interacting with the American Association for Woodturners and give talks at their symposia and write articles for their journals about tropical tree conservation, because the trees that turners love most, rosewood, ebony, and bloodwood, are endangered. And so for their conservation, it's required that we have policies to protect them and compliance with those policies. Another group that I've been interacting with are those people who are incarcerated in our state prisons and county jails and juvenile detention centers, people who live and work in environments that are almost completely deficit of nature. We started out with science lecture series and then began inviting conservationists to train inmates how to rear endangered species like the Oregon spotted frog and the Taylor checkerspot butterfly that are now released into protected areas. We also began thinking about ways to bring nature to those who are in the deepest part of our system of mass incarceration, and here again, the aesthetics of nature came into play. We couldn't bring plants and soil into those highly secure areas, but we could bring nature videos to their exercise rooms where they spend 1 hour a day outside of their 9x12 concrete cells. After a year of seeing these films, the men who watched these videos felt closer to nature, felt more positive about their relationship to the officers, and most significantly, committed 26% fewer violent infractions than those inmates who did not. So it was really the nature and the aesthetics of nature that brought solace and comfort and a reduction of stress and violence to this group. So all of these experiences have taught me something essential, that artists are not merely translators of science. They are partners in insight and communication. And these mutual invitations that we might make for each other, for scientists and artists to enter into each other's worlds, can, I think, achieve what neither can do alone, to inspire and to inform and to catalyze reflection and action on behalf of the natural world. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Nalini. I would like to invite Asher.
Hi, so my name is Asha J. I'm also a National Geographic explorer, but I've kind of worn many hats over the course of my life. I started out as a fashion designer, and then I went into textile development. Then I took a course in integrated design, which is systems design. And what all of that taught me is that there is a delineation between art and design. Earlier in my career, I think I used the terms pretty interchangeably, but over time I've really distilled that design is more intentional. It really just focuses on a question, and within that question, the way you frame it is where the answer lies, because it tells you what you're focusing on. What are you looking at versus what are you leaving out? And that makes sort of information very critical to what you incorporate in anything you do. And given that information plays such a critical role, you have to think about what people receive when you're encoding that data into a layout. So are they going to receive that intel emotionally? Are they going to receive it visually? Is the color important? Are the motifs important? If so, why? How many times are you repeating a motif? You look at symbology, you look at semiotics. So you're really thinking through very critically why each element is included. And variations within that had like interesting consequences in different markets, because you're actually facing an audience each time you're using visual language. And it is with the awareness that this audience is going to behave certain ways upon seeing what you're divulging to them. I primarily took over mass media conduits to release these packets of insight into the public, because I figured that was the most empowering way to galvanize the largest number of eyes towards a critical concern of our times. I also realized it's a good way to leverage these places where eyes traveled pretty frequently, even if they weren't actively wanting to focus on it, just because of the sheer scale of them. People wound up focusing on them while driving, while sitting at a bus stop. And so how could we leverage these conduits where visual cues are constantly feeding in buying behavior, making suggestions on how you should show up in the world, to actually look at things that matter. Because if it were left to me, I would convert every advertising conduit into an opportunity to look at nature, because that's what we should be focused on, because that's our living context. And that's really what took me into the space where I was like, why are we looking at Coca-Cola ads when we could be looking at tigers, you know? And the things that we repeat the most, the things that we focus on the most, is what we end up caring about, what we end up talking to each other about. It becomes community dialogue. And so I realized that, you know, putting a billboard up about elephants made people talk about elephants instead of talking about a brand. Because the way I see it, each of these species is a brand. I am their brand lobbyist. I'm working on their PR outreach on a daily basis. I'm currently focused on mountain lions. I am working on their rebrand, because we are, if you look at it, every species, everything that is, it's fine just as is. The only reason there is any orientation to it is because of how we see it, right? So a mountain lion becomes bad if it does something bad to you specifically. It becomes amazing if it gives you a great photograph and you win the contest. So the same animal that has literally done nothing to you apart from exist becomes good or bad, becomes all these other labels that we assign to it. So then it needs brand management because it becomes a brand. And so the way I look at it is, how can I represent these species in ways that feel intuitive, that make us feel emotionally connected to it? And also, looking beyond the story, how can we see it as an intrinsic part of who we are? Can we move beyond the labels and just be in presence with them, right? To truly connect through the act of living, through the act of breathing, through the act of being. And so for every single campaign I've gotten behind, including Mountain Lions now, I'm always strategizing interesting ways, which gives me a huge foray of tools to work with. Right now, I'm creating a lion mascot on AI. And it's an interesting use of artificial intelligence to give voice to something and make it as accessible as Smokey the Bear, right? So for me, it's like, how can I make Tony the tiger that's on your Frosties box connect back to tigers on the ground? How can we look at sporting team mascots be connected back to the wildlife they represent but take for granted? And so we forget like how often we appropriate wildlife imagery and use it for our own branding, but don't give back to those very species. And it's an obvious oversight. If it was happening to a human being, we'd be suing the heck out of that situation. So wildlife being represented without consent should be something we look at, right? So I'm always looking at it through those lenses, which is a different take. It is a design take because I'm not just looking at is it pretty? Is it visually alluring? Am I captivating an audience just for the sheer beauty of it? Which, of course, they're stunning. How can you not be taken in by the magic and majesty of each species? But if that's not what's ensnaring you, then maybe what matters to you is that, you know, that species is on your kid's sporting team, and you're carpooling all the kids of that soccer team, and therefore that's how you interact with that species on a daily basis. So if that is your only touch point to tigers, and you don't actually care about tigers in the wild, then how can I get you to care about tigers in the wild? And those touch points are often ignored. They're not leveraged enough. And if they were, I think we'd have a lot more people involved in the discourse. And then I'd say, like, in terms of art, I've done multiple things over the years, including installations, sculptures, paintings. But I felt like every single time I did any of those things, like, I'm stuck with the output of it, you know? And then that has its own footprint. And some of my art is tragically going to outlive me, which really weighs on my soul. And I think as an artist, you have to be conscious, like, every single thing that you do, and not just related to art, and anything that we do as humans, much of our activity outlives our own lifespan. And that is not the kind of imprint we should be living out if we are more conscientious, more aware, more present with what our sense of belonging is and where we fit in the scheme of things. And if we truly focus on that sense of belonging, then you wouldn't want to leave a corrosive footprint you wouldn't want to take from the next generation in order to thrive in this moment. In fact, that wouldn't be qualified as thriving, right? And so for me, also that messaging matters, which is why I've kind of stopped doing art. I don't do installations, I don't do any of those things. I stick to digital media now, simply because for me it feels like I'm not leaving a physical, tangible, non-perishable after I cease to exist. Because as beautiful as it feels in the moment to create it, and as like much you feel in flow doing it, it feels irresponsible if you really think about it, even from a design perspective, which is, you think about form and function tremendously when you see it through a design filter. And lastly, I would always say, like, when I'm creating a campaign, I look at it through the premise of a plot, which is to say, what is the premise of something? So to truly look at its context, then to look at the language in which it's being disseminated, because sometimes we might have words for certain ideas which simply do not exist in other countries and other languages, and vice versa. Like, other countries have unique concepts and ideas that we simply cannot translate into English. To have that respect and awareness of how something is communicated in each context, and therefore the kind of relationship that can occur, which may not be prevalent because we lack the way to say it. So for instance, in Japan, just walking between trees has a word, right? Like, enjoying being in the presence of trees has a word, but we don't have that acknowledgement, and therefore it's not in our vernacular or our daily awareness. And so working on campaigns globally has made me super aware of language. The next one would be, are you stating what's obvious? Because oftentimes we think everyone knows the same thing, that we're all working out of the same foundational knowledge. Often that's not true. So I always say, state what's obvious. Every single campaign I've created has been the most obvious thing there is to say about that species. And people often come up to me and tell me, oh, that's so self-evident. And I'm like, great, I'm glad we're on the same page. We finally are getting there. And then the last one is triggers. Every single thing you put out there is going to trigger somebody in some way. So having accountability toward that which you put out matters, because sometimes it can have negative or adversarial reactions in people. And to be able to navigate that discomfort with humility and care and compassion, as opposed to getting defensive and supporting your position at the cost of someone who's at odds with you, only seeds more violence, more conflict in the world. So I always encourage having humility when creating content, when creating anything, because that way you're actually being truly inclusive and not creating more dissension in the world. That's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Seth.
Well, hello, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and what an honor to be on this panel. So I'm a composer. I write music using data, large language models, but then of course pencil and paper and orchestral instruments. And actually in my day job, I am currently training students to become the next generation of pop stars. So I have like my view of music is quite expansive. And as I was considering this topic of the use of nature in my own work, I was also reflecting on the use of nature in the history of music and sound art. And I guess, I was, maybe as a way to sort of like warm us up to the topic and reveal a bit of my thoughts on this, I thought I'd play a couple of examples of musical reflections on nature. And so what pops into mind is, first is the romantic era of music. So this would be like, the 1850s to early 1900s. And the romantic ideals of nature, often referred to as like the sublime, this immense, untamed power observed by artists and sort of distilled as this, awe-inspiring, almost like fear-filling sort of presence. And in many ways, like this reflection of like the spiritual, and in some ways like holy or magical. And the composers that pop into mind would be the pastoral symphony of Beethoven, or like Debussy's La Mer. And just to give you an audio example, like I've promised here, I'm just going to play you a little bit of Debussy's La Mer, just to get a sense of what that sounds like. Okay, yeah, so very impressionistic, right? So kind of reflecting on that and reflecting the emotional response of the artist towards observing nature. But moving forward towards modernism, there's a shift in the way that artists think about nature. There's a bit of a like idea of like mastery and control over nature, and this is usually manifested in like science and technology. What comes to mind is like this period in the let's say like 1940s to 1960s or so is characterized by, at least in music, like the use of the tape recorder. And so this is a new technology that was used to capture not an impression of nature, but an actual audio replication of the sounds of nature. And so we find composers that are inspired by this and finding, like, I would say, concrete inspiration, saying not so much like how do I feel about nature, but like what does nature sound like and how do I bring that into the concert hall in this case, right? Bring it into my medium. And so examples from this might be Oliver Messiaen's bird song pieces. So a piece like Oiseau Exotique, and I'll play you an example of this where Messiaen was able to get a hold of bird song recordings from North America and then carefully transcribed them into chamber music. And so what I'll play for you is the bird song recording and then a short example of that bird transcription. So this is Messiaen's Oiseau Exotique. Interesting, right? Yeah. And similarly, in the 1970s, when recording of humpback whales became extremely popular. I know you're all nodding your heads. Yeah, songs of the humpback whales. That also made its way through, musicians. And we have a piece by George Crumb called Vox Balaeniae, which is in many ways imitating those, although I'm not sure it's a direct transcription, but like you can clearly hear the voice of the whale that he's referencing. So here's a whale recording from the 1970 album Songs of the Humpback Whale, followed by just a little bit of George Crumb's Vox Balaeniae. Yeah, so that's an example of, I would say, a modernist approach where we're using nature more directly. And I would say there's a bit of a idea of kind of like mastery and control in there, which I would paint as not great. But in any case, it's much more direct. It's less impressionistic. And then as we look towards the turn of the millennium, we see this like explosion of ways to use nature. Everything from sound art and field recordings to this idea of acoustic ecology. We have soundscape composition pieces by composers like John Luther Adams, which are just like these monumental experiences that are meant to like overwhelm the listener with nature's like massive power. The acoustic ecology thing is worth just a touch point here for us, which is to basically observe the world over long periods of time through audio capture and then note the resulting changes acoustically over time. And this involves people like R. Murray Schafer, who wrote a famous book called The Tuning of the World, which kind of references this idea of that we are out of whack with nature acoustically because of all of the sounds that, as humans, we are polluting the environment with, and we need to get back in touch with the sound of nature to be right with the world. To people like Hildegard Westerkamp, who would go on these extended sound walks with her recorder and just kind of narrate the experience. I want to play for you this. This is such a great example because it really shows like the kind of the purity of the approach, and also the use of technology to dig deeper than our senses sometimes allow us. So here's a little bit of I've edited this to kind of get us to the point here. This is Hildegard Westerkamp's Kitts Beach Sound Walk.
I'm on Kitts Beach in Vancouver. I'm standing among some large rocks full of barnacles and seaweed. The tiny clicking sounds that you hear are the meeting of the water and the barnacles. But I'm trying to listen to those tiny sounds in more detail now. Suddenly, the background sound of the city seems louder again. It interferes with my listening. Luckily, we have bandpass filters and...
Oh, I guess I gave up there. That's okay. She starts to dig deeper and deeper into a realm that we can't quite perceive, which leads me to my last little kind of overview point here that I'd like to make, which is at some point we've reached the limit of our human perception, and that leads to this field of data sonification, which I've spent a lot of time personally exploring ways in which we can make the inaudible or the not audible suddenly available to our perception. There's plenty of examples of uses of nature. I'll just list a couple here. Things like taking volcano seismic data and making that audible and giving meaning to the different kind of markers that appear in those data sets, and turning them into meaningful sounds so that we can hear, for example, there's this guy, Leif Karlstrom, who did this volcano listening project, and it observed the collapse of the Kilauea caldera over a 10-year period of time. You can hear like the building patterns to the kind of culminating in that final collapse, and it's really just immediately obvious to our ears. And yet it's also extremely listenable as a piece of art by itself. Or the work by Kimberly Arcand and Matt Russo, who explore beyond the Earth, which I know is maybe outside of our topic, but at least from an observer point on Earth, we can look at the galaxy as a whole, and you can glean so much information from either sonifying image data or taking measurable like X-ray light data and turning that into sound. I'll play you one example just because it's so beautiful.
Yes.
Am I going way over time? Okay.
No, you go
right.
ahead. I want to hear that.
This will be my last audio example, I promise. Where have we gone here? Here it is. So where we're taking an image of the X-ray data of the galactic center and basically mapping that RGB pixel values to different sonic parameters, but also thinking artistically, how do we make this sound like the galactic center? And so this is what Russo and Arcand came up with. Yeah, I mean, so it's beautiful, and in many ways doesn't require much explanation, I don't think. I think just to kind of like give a quick summary before we continue on here. I would just say, like, my own work, obviously, if we get a chance to talk about it, I've touched on many of these different things, from like nature as an impression to bringing in field recordings to sonifying data. And I find all of those avenues really fascinating personally from the point of view of someone who's making art. And I think, just as I reflect on my own approach, my idea is to move our idea of thinking of nature as this thing that's outside of us and seeing us as embedded inside of nature and as part of this greater system of interaction. And my hope is that in this art that it goes from an experience to a change of perspective in the audience members. So, thank you.
Thank you, Seth. And I would like to kind of continue with that last part of the conversation and kind of start with one question to the panelists around how do you define your relationship with the natural environment? Is it a subject? Is it a collaborator? Is it something else? And how that relationship has changed over the years.
So when I was younger, I felt this very deep, visceral connection to nature. So anything that happened to it, it felt like, especially moments where I saw any devastation or like sea turtles washing up along the shoreline or their flippers cut off or anything, it would affect me like on such a debilitating level. Like I could not, the empathy made me channel it as such a devastating reaction, and that's because I took it so personally. It felt like parts of me were dying outside of me, and I could never quite express that relationship in a way that was not through the lens of grief, because all I always focused on, and my mom once asked me this, she's like, why do you always see death all around you? And it's like, that's what my eyes went to. It's like I always saw the thing that was negative that was happening, and never the moments of life just thriving, because it's easier to like see what's not working, because you kind of want to avoid that, right? Like we, as a species, want to preserve, want to be safe, and want to survive. And so we always look at examples of when that is not happening so that we can learn from it and do better, right? And so I think I just always focus on the negative. And then like a couple of years ago, I had like a very spiritual, really unexpected, transcendent moment where I was just like, I don't know how it happened, but I woke up one morning and I could for once see that I was separate from my mind, my thinking mind, my body, my everything. And it was just the state of beingness, complete presence. And it was utterly intoxicating because there was such an implicit sense of oneness, such a sense of aliveness, such a sense of deep and unfettered connection, unbound connection to everything. And for 3 months in New York City, all I did was stare at squirrels and trees. And all my friends were like, you're definitely on something, or something's gone very wrong with you. But I just remember feeling the sense of aliveness pulsating through every part of me and in everything around me. And there was no separation. There was no difference between the car that was honking and the squirrel that was chirping. Everything is just this pulsating aliveness, and that made me appreciate us, because up until then I kind of hated on humanity and like was at odds between nature and humanity, which was me fracturing the whole into my perception, which is a limited take on that wholeness by saying I'm different, we're different, and nature's different, and we're not. And if you truly feel that sense of aliveness and connection, that sense of breath going through all of us, the tree that's breathing out is breathing into you, it's such a magical, wonderful way of feeling what it means to be human, just to be human, not doing anything, not any role, not serving any function, just being you. Just waking up and breathing out and being you is such a magical gift. And I think that now finding expression in my work has been very uplifting. I have so much joy. I just love the heck out of everything and everyone. I think you're all just beautiful little beings of light just staring back at me right now. And I can't wait to see what we all do together, you know? And I think we focus on so much gloom and doom, but like really look at how much wonder we're capable of, just like the things that he's saying. We're such like quirky little beings. We can like look at this cosmos and look at the picture of it and say, wow, what would that sound like? And let's create an orchestra out of it. We do extraordinary things. And I think to lose sight of that is to lose sight of us and what it means to be human, and therefore to show up fully as us for all that is, because it's all one thing. And I think that's been very transformative in my journey of like communication, because it's moved me past and out of communicating into communion, which is just being present with all of it. So.
That was great. I love that. And I feel that's where I started, my connection to nature, which led me to science, which was as a kid, climbing trees in my parents' front yards. The canopy of those, and it was a very short canopy. This was Bethesda, Maryland, little maple trees, but I would climb them after school, you know, every day. And I have 4 brothers and sisters. My dad was a Hindu from India, my mother an Orthodox Jew from Russia. And so like I had this really chaotic and bizarre kind of family with chores and homework and pets and so forth. And so when I would climb a tree, one of those 8 maple trees in the driveway, I felt like this is my place. There's no parents up here. There's no siblings to squabble with, no chores to do. It's just me being here with this tree. And I felt that connection from earth to sky. And that was when I said, somehow when I'm a grown-up, I'm going to do something to help trees because they're helping me. And I ended up choosing science. And in choosing science, where you really need to be objective about what you study, nature became a bit further from me, from that emotional connection that you're talking about, that spiritual connection that you're talking about. I think necessary, but not unbeneficial. It was a way to come to understand trees in a deep way, through one way of knowing. And then as I progressed through that and seeing what was going on with nature, with deforestation and climate change, I felt I had to shift again. Instead of going from this sort of spiritual childhood connection to science and an adult analysis of trees and forests, I realized that to connect with people, as I said in my introduction, in more of an emotional way, a storytelling way, a way that people could relate to that. And so just listening to you talk about what you just talked about, but also what you said earlier about using nature as leverage points, leveraging messages with images and with you, Seth, with sounds of nature, of teaching us that we can be connected to nature through the medium of art, that is something that has now become an important part of my life. And one way to do what you were talking about is using objects in the spaces that we just walk around in, and that one of those is fashion. And so one of the things I've been working on is to connect people to nature through the clothing they wear. And so we've started working to develop a nature, it's called In Nature, a fashion line that depicts botanically correct images of nature. And I'd actually like to call on Carol Brewer, who's sitting in the 3rd row here, who, would you stand up, Carol? So she's wearing a jacket that we made for her. She studies water uptake by leaves, and we created this jacket for her so that when she walks around the CWA hallways and someone says, Carol, I love your jacket, she can then start talking about uptake of water through foliage and the amazingness of plants and the wonder that we feel when we encounter plants. And that's really hard to do with plants because, I'm sort of jealous of mountain lions and humpback whales because they express themselves with their sounds and trees don't do that. So we have to creatively, through art, come up with ways that we can practice this combination of the spiritual connection we have, the emotional connection we have with nature, with our understanding and information that we have about trees and nature in ways that other people can relate to and understand those.
In terms of collaboration, I've spent a lot of time working with scientists, experts in some field that is not my field. And a lot of my work as a collaborator has been to try to understand their field as best as I can, and translate it to my expertise. And so there's like this act of translation, and being responsible for like a deep understanding of my own domain, but the ability to talk across domains intelligently enough to like translate. So the question about collaborating with nature, actually, it strikes me as a bit of like, I don't know. I haven't actually questioned that maybe deeply enough. And Asher, you brought up earlier this idea of like asking permission of nature, like, can you be a collaborator, right? And so that's actually really a fascinating and new thought for me that I've not spent a lot of time talking about. Would you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I think part of it is wondering from its perspective, how would it want to be represented? What is it trying to convey from its own perspective without the anthropocentric, anthropomorphic take on it, which is that it's always human-centered, right? And it's very easy to go from the ego bias. The artist bias is also an ego bias. It's from you, the artist. But if you look to truly collaborate, you want to enlist that participation, and you want to create the space and hold the space to invite the other in. And there are a lot of examples of artists doing this where they allow for nature or like for a human person, like a person that's incorporated into the exhibit or into the space, to have a moment of spontaneous say, to leave an imprint behind, to have a moment of interaction that was not orchestrated but just occurred and you have happened to be there for it. So I think it's an act of allowing and an act of holding space for the other to be able to step in and step up and say their piece. And we can do this for each other. We can do this for indigenous communities. Like, I think we're all asking for that allowing to occur more now than ever before.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's incredibly fascinating. And in some ways, it reflects this move of my own artistically away from that impressionistic view of nature, where it's like my take on this and how I felt about it, and then writing a piece of music, and more towards trying to respect the scientific data that we can collect on nature, and trying to represent it accurately and meaningfully, like meaningfully for us as the science-interested public, but also meaningful for the scientists themselves, that they actually might hear their data and learn new things through that act of perception that they're not used to, perhaps. And so, yeah, maybe that's this, for me, a personal journey towards honoring that, like nature being itself without me trying to impose myself on it and speak for it in my voice, but instead letting it just speak for itself. Maybe.
Yeah,
I
Nalini.
think that this touches on a tension that I have always felt with working with nature as a scientist. When I was a little kid, that little Nalini who climbed into the canopy of the maple trees, there were so many questions that came to my mind about, well, how this tree lived, and what does it think of squirrels moving through its tree crowns, and why did it branch this way instead of that way? And I dreamed of inventing a microphone that I could stick into the tree, put on my headphones, and ask questions of it. And I figured that the output, and talking to a sound person here, would be very slow because trees grow so slowly. And I would have to turn up the dial to sort of get the answers to my questions. And I realized when I became a grown-up that I was never going to invent that microphone. And instead but I could ask questions of trees and forests through the approach of science. I could pose a hypothesis. I could design an experiment. I could make observations. I could analyze those data and come up with some answer to my questions, and then pass that on to other scientists to take on the next question and the next. But in that process of doing experiments, especially, rather than just observations, I have had to do some brutal things to the trees that I care about. I strip canopy plants off of whole trees. I cut off branches and lower them to the ground. I inject dyes into them in order to understand the circulation. And so there's this constant tension of my collaboration, my co-working is it exploitative? Are these trees my slaves or prisoners that I'm doing experiments on? Or are we collaborators in that I am asking and gaining answers from them in order to better manage them, better use them, better interact interact with them, better communicate to people to incite actions that will actually protect them. And so I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's a really interesting one to ask. And I would say also, especially working with trees who do not speak, do not have a language that we can understand, is that it's also attention to know and to think about the limitations, the presumptions I must make in terms of working with these organisms, in terms of interpreting how they are responding or how I am responding to them. And so these are things I think that scientists have to think about when they collaborate, supposedly, or work with, or act with, or be with nature in order to satisfy their curiosity and be better curators and managers and co-livers, I guess, with elements of nature.
This is great, and you guys, I'm loving all the conversations that they're coming here. I have a lot of more questions. I only asked one, but kind of was trying to run out of time. They passed me some questions from the audience. There's a couple, several really good, but there's one that kind of I want to pose to you is, what do you think the difference between using a nature sound/image and being in nature while co-creating?
So for me, I think when I am creating something, it becomes static, right? It's a sliver of the whole. And you've chosen to focus on that sliver of information, of a visual cue, of a moment of existence that transpired. The difference between that and actually being in nature, which I far prefer now, I've become this person who meditates all the time, so it's like, and the way I meditate best is actually staring at trees, because trees can really put you in touch with stillness. They're just so beautiful to watch, just like without naming it, if you just are with it, just to see how it moves and it's still itself. It's just being. It's so effortless, and it really puts me in a very magical space within myself. So I'm very addicted to trees. But I'll say, when you're in nature, I think it's very emergent, right? You can never predict what exactly is going to happen the next instant. You're always surprised. You're always taken in. Like, even with my dogs, like, I can't expect them to do the thing that I think they're going to do in the very next second, which is why they tickle you. They make you laugh. They make you, like, say weird sounds, because you can't quite calibrate and be proper around living things, because it's just being and unfolding as it's going to. So like, the same bird that branched one way might come up to you right a second later and just sit by your side for no reason, and you're like, oh, you've never done this before, you know? And so you're like always surprised. Like, even in the oceans, like, I've had a dolphin come up to me out of nowhere and just hang out with me, you know? And it's not something you can go in expecting, and that's part of the gift of it, is it's ephemeral. It happens in that instant. If you're not there fully for it, it's gone, and it's never going to happen in that exact way ever again. And it doesn't matter what the species is, whether it's a caterpillar, anything you spend time with, if you're fully in it, you will be surprised by it, because it has that spontaneity and originality to its being. And I think it's very hard to bring that alive unless you're actually allowing for people to be a part of that immersive space. And we've tried to do it through VR, AR, and all these ways, but nothing compares to actually going out, and even if it's just a tiny patch of grass, a tiny patch of wild meadow, just sitting with one flower will give you all the wisdom that you would try to get through all the knowledge by reading thousands of books. You get more from that one instant of actual connection. And I think that that's not something we can replicate successfully. We can do beautiful things, and we have, but it's not the same as being out in a real moment of connection with the wild.
Yeah, I'll say, just anecdotally, I feel like in my work involving nature, I feel like I'm trying to get to nature. Like the use of an image or a sound to either inspire or directly motivate an artwork, I feel like is in some ways like a poor substitute for just being in nature. And my anecdote is that there was a summer that I lived and worked in Grand Lake, Colorado, up in the, right in the front door for the Rocky Mountain National Park. And as part of my work there, I was supposed to be writing music. And I found that it was one of the most difficult places for me to write music because I just wanted to be in nature. I was not inspired by nature. I felt like I was satisfied in nature artistically. And I think that's an interesting and maybe even problematic for an artist to say, but it's what happened to me. It was my experience is that I was more. My desire was to just be in the trees and to look up and listen to the sound of the wind and to look at the mountain ranges rather than to sit and try to generate a piece of art that was somehow inspired by that. So I find for myself anyway that it's actually easy for me to make art when I remove myself from nature and reflect on it, or remove myself and give myself a sample of nature to work with. So I'm not sure what the takeaway from that is, but that's just my own kind of reflection on that.
Nalini?
Yeah, I think that's what Asher was talking about is really true, that being present in nature is just invaluable and irreplaceable, and nature imagery can do a lot, but not everything in terms of transmitting that. However, I think the translation of being in nature to visual imagery can sometimes tell us something about nature that we don't get when we're out there. And I'll give you an example of this. People have often said, well, trees are so boring compared to mountain lions because trees don't move. And that is true if you look at the trunk of a mature old growth tree, right? You can't move it. It's immovable. But anybody who lies down on the forest floor and looks up at the canopy, or if you climb into the canopy with me, you'll see that the canopy and the individual twigs and leaves are incredibly dynamic. They're moving all the time. And so I decided to record that with a visual image. So I tied little paintbrushes with green paint to the tips of twigs. And then, could you put your hand out just to be the twigs? So held up a canvas for 2 minutes. And then as Asher's fingers were moving in the wind, these paintbrushes then made this piece of art, which was really cool. And it was a manifestation of the actual movement of this tree. Now, being a quantitative scientist, I couldn't stop there. I had to find out how far that tree had moved. So I held this up for 2 minutes, and I added up all the segments that the tree had moved, added them all up, multiplied the number of twigs per branch, the number of branches per tree, and the number of minutes per day, and the number of days per year. And I came out with an estimation of how far a single Douglas fir tree could move in a year. This seemingly immovable tree, how far do you think it moved? If you add up all of these segments. 1,000 miles, 186,540 miles. That is 7 times around the circumference of our globe. And so now when you go to a cocktail party this afternoon or this evening, and someone says, trees are so boring compared to humpback whales and mountain lions, you can say, well, actually, a single tree can move around the world 7 times. And I say that this is sort of a silly measurement, but what it means to me in terms of the context of this question is that there's some things that we can come to understand and communicate through the medium of a visual image that we could not get if we just stood under a tree and watched these little leaves move. And I think that's a metaphor also for intractable problems. Well, climate change, how are we going to deal with that? The Strait of Hormuz, how are we going to deal with that? That is an intractable problem that is not going to go anywhere. We cannot move it. But when you look at some other part of that problem, the leaves instead of the trunk, small movements, small changes, small efforts can really push that problem 7 times around the world, and I think provides something of hope for ourselves in the face of the seemingly intractable problems that we face in our environmental and social realms that has come from the image, not just being there, but in addition to being there, to the movement of small pieces.
Thank you, Nalini. One last question, we're kind of starting to wrap up here, is what do you hope audiences feel or reflect on when they encounter your work? As a scientist, as an artist, as a composer?
Well, as a scientist, the word scientist comes from the Latin word scio, to know. to know it to the fullest possible extent. So I think as the scientist in me wants people to come away knowing more than they did. But the sort of human person that I am wants them not just to know more, but to be moved to think about how can I do something, feel something, think something that might move towards the protection of the things that I study.
Yeah, I think very similar to that. I feel like what I stated earlier was this idea of involving audiences in my work that make them feel embedded in the ongoing kind of unfolding of, like you said, the emergent behaviors of nature. And I feel like the ideal reaction to the work is that they feel that connection and they want to participate. They want to engage nature playfully, engage nature through exploration, and yeah, ultimately like kind of find their identity within nature as part of like this larger kind of artistic experience.
For me, it's in one word, attention, because I think it's a very rare commodity, especially in today's world where a story breaks every 8 seconds. And so your attention is taken in a new direction literally every 8 seconds. To hold your mind in one place for longer than that is a feat in and of itself. We have numerous ways to be constantly distracted and taken outside of ourselves, so we don't know what it means to be with ourselves, which means it makes it very hard for people to know what it means to be with any other living being in their space. So like to get them to understand the value of being with a mountain lion when they can't even be with themselves is also a challenge. So I think the greatest aspect of every campaign I put out is to build out a narrative arc that garners more and more of that attention. So how can I get you to give up more seconds of your time that would otherwise go towards consuming content without any intention, just constantly taking things in without actually consolidating, towards consolidating around that maybe one species for that one day, and then maybe it takes up a little bit more of your energy and space and time, and then slowly you begin to cohabit as you are in reality, whether you're aware of it or not, with a mountain lion, because that is your reality. You do cohabit a world where mountain lions exist, but you are not on a daily basis bringing your attention to that. And so how can I bring your attention to the things that are living and breathing and being in your natural living environment that you take for granted or are otherwise not connecting to? So that's what I pander to.
Well, great. Thank you all for participating in this panel. We're a little earlier, like, I don't know, we're closing 9 minutes earlier. I don't know if there's any one final question from the audience.
Anyone from there? Any of the kids have any questions?
Yeah, any of the kids? There is one question that we have a couple more minutes. I'm trying to be respectful of the time, everyone's time, and the panel time. This is for Dr. Schaffer. It says, the book 1 Square Inch of Silence, In Search of Silence in Nature. Is it possible in nature to experience absolute silence?
Like technically? I mean, sure, there are places in nature that are devoid of silence, but I think what that reveals is the limitations of our perceptions, right? So that our ears are these finely tuned devices to operate in the medium in which we exist, which is the atmosphere made up of, oxygen and nitrogen, and sound transmits through that medium, and where there's an absence of that medium for which our ears have evolved to become quite good, then we will experience silence. I guess I'm not sure that's the answer you're looking for, but I would also say that there are incredible thoughts on silence as art. I'll just throw that out there too. I'm thinking of John Cage as someone who spoke quite a bit about this idea of silence as a manifestation of an artistic statement. Thinking of like Pauline Oliveros, who developed deep listening methods to kind of both meditate, but also like self-examine through the opening of our ears. And so there's a lot of like artistic backing for this idea of silence or near silence as a way to explore ourselves and sort of our inner being, but also the world around us.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could add a thought to that. So recently, in one of the conversations I had with a monk, was he mentioned how true silence is not about asking the rest of the world to simmer down and pipe down. It's about you not thinking all the time. And so if you silence this mental chatter, this constant commentary that's always running on everything, and you're just quiet, it's such a gift, because it doesn't feel like noise anymore. You could be hearing the loudest, most annoying, repetitive sounds outside, and it's still, the silence within is all that you need to just take all of that in as silence still. So silence for me is very dynamic, and the more I've practiced being quiet within, the more listening becomes an act of being receptive, of letting things come through and come to you without you having to offer a commentary on everything that's unfolding. Let it just be, give it that gift.
Nalini, any final thoughts? Not to put you on the spot.
I'll be silent about that question.
Great. Well, with that said, I just want to thank you, the panelists, and I want to give them a round of applause. And thank you all for joining us. Good closing remarks, Nalini.